City of Sioux Falls is dedicated to improving the water quality of the Big Sioux River. One of the sources of pollution to our waterways is stormwater runoff. Stormwater runoff refers to any form of precipitation or snowmelt which washes over a surface and into the storm drainage system. As the water runs over the surface, it will pick up any debris, sediment, or pollution it can carry. Once the water is in the storm drainage system, it is discharged into the Big Sioux River with little or no treatment. Hi, I'm Jessica Lanchin, Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Sioux Falls. Today I have Jeff Hemingway with the NRCS here to show us a little bit about how stormwater behaves in the urban environment. Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about your rainfall simulator that you brought for us?
The Rainfall simulator is something that NRCS purchased about 5 or 6 years ago, really to start looking at some of the differences in runoff and infiltration on agricultural lands, but it has a really excellent relationship with urban areas also. So we'd really like to talk a little bit about that today. The Rainfall simulator is really set up to really look at runoff and infiltration. And the interesting thing is it makes a difference on what we actually have as far as our land management. And we're going to put on about 1.5 inches of water, something in the next few minutes, and look at some of those characteristics. But first, before we talk about the samples, let's talk about how this thing really works. That 1.5 inches of water is going to come down, like say, in about 7 to 10 minutes, something like that. And it's actually going to either run off or it's going to infiltrate through the sample, through the soil, etc. And that's really what the simulator is set up to do. If it actually hits, that raindrop hits the surface of whatever the sample is, and in this particular case it happens to be concrete, if it runs off, it'll go through the funnel and into the front jar. However, if it infiltrates, in other words, if that water actually goes through the sample, in other words, maybe in through the soil, it will actually then go into the back jar. In other words, there's a catchment pan underneath the pan itself that'll actually look at the infiltration water. So interestingly enough, the front set of jars are what's going to run off, and the back set of jars are what's infiltrating or what's going through that soil sample.
Well, Jeff, before we start, let's go through each sample and see what we're looking at here today. Can you
Sure.
tell me what this sample would represent here?
Yeah, you know what, interestingly enough is the city actually has some areas that are seeded back into native grasses. And that's really kind of a cool thing, to me anyway. And this is a sample of those native grasses. You can see it's big, tall grass. And that sample is like I say, really kind of cool, really kind of different, etc. But there's a number of these that are really different too. But we go on to the next one, and I mentioned before that this is concrete, but it's a different concrete. It's actually a porous concrete.
Okay.
And porous concrete is kind of a new product, and it actually has some different relationships than most people actually think. As you think of concrete, we'll look at that sample, and it'll be a lot different than what we normally think about.
Okay.
The next sample actually represents a shingled roof. And typically you'd say, well, gee, why should we be looking at that? Well, we have a lot of impermeable surfaces across the city, a lot of roofs, etc. A lot of runoff comes off those areas. Let's look at see what happens to that sample as we run the Rainfall simulator.
Great. And how about this one here?
The next sample is, of course, you can see it's green grass. It actually is a green grass seeded back, but you know, at some point, is it seeded back? Are we treating our soils correctly, etc.? And the problem that we have in this particular case is it's a very compacted sample. And it's going to have some different characteristics than we really think it probably should, but compacted grass sample.
And what would a tray like this represent?
The last sample that we actually have here is a really tilled sample, and you can see that it would really represent something that we have on a construction site, something that's not seeded back, what that really looks like right now, and it's a lot different than what people think. Now, when you drive by and you see a construction site, people think, well, gee, boy, there's some runoff coming off that, etc. But we really need to pay attention and see what that really looks like, and that's what that's going to represent today.
We've got a lot of these types of surfaces here in Sioux Falls, so I'm excited to see how they behave when we get that 1 to 2 inch rainfall event.
It should be a lot of fun to run this thing,
Yeah,
too.
absolutely.
So.
Okay, Jeff, the rainfall simulator's all finished, so let's take a look at the results starting here with the native grasses.
Cool. Yeah, let's look at this thing. Is again, the front jar is supposed to be the runoff, and the back jar is what went through the soil sample and what infiltrated. And if we look at the native grass, it's really pretty interesting to me. There's relatively no water in the jar up front, which means it really didn't have any runoff. And we end up with about, well, I don't know, about 2 inches of water in the back. Looks really pretty clear. Really interesting to me. It's absorbed a lot of water. And how do I know that? Because the next sample that we're looking at right across from there is this porous concrete that we were talking about. And I believe that there's a park here in Sioux Falls that actually has porous concrete in the park, in the parking lot, that is. And it's interesting to me that we're looking at that. It says very little to actually, there's no runoff on the jar, but all the water actually went through the sample, and you can see that in the back, which is really kind of cool. Right. And you can see that comparison that between the two, there's a lot of water that grass sample is really soaked up and absorbed.
Right. With both of these samples, I see very little runoff. Most of the water was infiltrated in, and the water that was infiltrated in with the native grasses, like you said, it's very clear.
Which is a really kind of neat thing. As we get down and we'll look at some of the other samples, that's not the case. So.
Yes, yeah. So moving on here to the roof here.
The roof reacted much as we thought. As an example, of course, if we have a properly constructed roof, we're going to end up with it moving off the site. So here's our jar. We have a lot of runoff came off of that, fully expected on a roof for that to actually happen.
Right. And how about here with our turf?
Well, the next sample is really where, to me, it really gets interesting.
Right.
Is we start really talking about how we're going to manage our grass, turf, within the city, etc. And at some point, if we end up with a compacted sample, we end up with, well, a lot of it actually running off. And not only does it run off, but notice the color of the runoff. We end up with a lot of soil moving off. And from my standpoint, most people say, well, gee, that's not good. We've got soil moving off. But we also have to remember that there's a lot of people in town that applied fertilizers. They put on pest management control out there, weed control, etc. And at some point, that's going to come off with that runoff also. And of course, that goes over into our rivers.
Right, the runoff will go into our storm drainage system, which a lot of people don't realize that's separate from our sanitary sewer system. So that runoff is not going to be treated or have very little treatment before it gets discharged to the Big Sioux River.
And like I say, that's just, well, those are pollutants within our river system and something we'd really not like to have. What we noticed back here also is that there's some that actually infiltrated through the sample. I'm going to suggest, and we're going to take a look at that in a minute, that some of that was actually what I call preferential flow around the outside of the pan. But we'll look at that and talk about that right after we maybe look at this next sample.
Our construction site sample here.
Well, that's really interesting to me. But you can actually see how smooth that soil surface is. A lot of that actually ran off, and in fact, all of it ran off, it appears. Yeah. And a lot of the soil actually went with it. Again, talking again about that not only the soil actually, which is really kind of a detrimental loss to our environment, but also the pollutants that went with it. That's really something that's a challenge for us that we need to overcome. So, well, I'm a soils guy, and I always like to look at soils. So we're gonna have to turn these samples over and look at them. So
let's take a look. Yeah.
All right. One of the first things we want to do is we pull out the rain gauge, of course, and we put on about 2 inches of water pretty rapidly. So this was a really major, intense rainfall event. We want to make sure that that's actually the case. We know that. And let's pull a couple of these samples apart and take a look at it, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it. So this will give us a better idea of how the water infiltrated into the ground.
Always really looking at what I call soil structure, why the sample reacted the way it did. So keep in mind, this is my turf, really pretty compacted, had quite a bit of runoff on that sample. So let's just turn it over and take a look at it. What I look at is I see right here there's actually a portion of that sample that's actually dry. And if you take apart the sample, you can see how hard and compacted it really is.
Right, it just crumbles, yeah.
The sample is more like a brick than it is soils, and that's the challenge that we really have is functionally looking at our soils more as a living thing than, well, as something to either drive on or really not care about. So we need to pay more attention. But we'll look at this some more, the soil structure, as we start looking at that comparison with especially our native grass sample. It should be a lot different.
Yeah, sounds good.
In the meantime, let's pull this other sample right here. This is our construction site. In other words, the one that's all the vegetation's been taken off and destroyed. And again, on this sample, you can see all the runoff that actually occurred. And again, as I was talking about before, you can see how smooth that soil surface is.
Right.
That soil structure is really degraded by that raindrop impact, and it reoriented the soil particles on the soil surface and really stopped a lot of the water movement down into the soil. So let's take it and flip this over and see what our soil structure looks on this one.
Oh, wow.
And the fact of the matter is, it's dry on the bottom.
It's dry, yeah.
And what's really interesting to me is most people think that by tilling up their soils or having this construction site that's all worked up, it infiltrates water better than if it were, let's say, under a grass stand. And that's really not true.
Right.
In fact, it doesn't infiltrate water very well at all. This soil is a loam soil. All these are loams that we're actually dealing with there today. And a loam soil will actually hold about 2 inches of water per foot. Well, we just put on 2 inches of water, and that should go down 12 inches. And in fact, it didn't even go down an inch, maybe 1.5 inches within my pan, which is 2¼ inches deep in this sample. So to me, it's really interesting to start to realize that soil structure has this major effect on, well, infiltration and runoff.
Right.
Okay, let's pull apart the native grass sample and see what it looks like. Of course, pretty easy to see that we've got this big tall grass plant, but what people don't realize about this big tall grass plant is there's all that roots below the soil surface also. And you can see all the roots below the soil surface. But what I wanted to point out was just this, when we start really looking at structural differences, is that as you see here, that not only do we have structural difference, but we have a lot of biological life.
Oh, yeah.
And at some point, as you start comparing that to this, you see that there's this huge difference, and this looks like what I'd call kind of like black cottage cheese. It's kind of like that crumbly type of structure, where this is really hard and compacted, and you can see that there's this huge difference between the two. And of course, when we started really looking at the characteristics of runoff, for all practical purposes there are none, really absorbs the water on site, makes this huge difference as far as runoff. And from my standpoint, it's as we were talking about before, that soil biology really plays this huge role in the soil structure and the macropores. And I always like doing this demonstration just so that we can get people to think about, well, what they're doing to soils and how they should actually be managing those soils, maybe more properly than they have been in the past.
Now, the vegetation did not prevent any of that water from infiltrating in, and I think that a lot of people don't realize that.
Well, in a lot of cases, people think that all this tall vegetation actually, well, stops infiltration. It doesn't infiltrate as well, and in fact, it's the opposite. When we really start looking at those characteristics, it's this root mass, that biology, that above ground canopy that really stops that kinetic energy from hitting the soil surface on that raindrop, just makes this huge difference.
The other thing that I noticed too, I can hardly see any roots here at the bottom of this pan, but here I can see there's a tremendous amount of roots even showing.
You know, and that's really just an excellent point, is that we start talking about these native grasses, and they'll have root systems that go down to 3 feet or so, and because of our limited root system in our Kentucky bluegrass, but also because of the compacted soil that we actually have, you don't end up with that root mass going down, and of course, that really affects these water characteristics. Just makes this huge difference.
So Jeff, we took a look at the rainfall simulator, what the soil looks like underneath, but what's the takeaway here today? What can homeowners do to really help prevent that runoff and increase infiltration?
Well, you know, the cool thing is that we actually can change our management to, well, increase infiltration and reduce runoff, which of course has this major impact on flooding within an urban environment. And the interesting thing is that, you know, even from a Kentucky bluegrass standpoint, we could increase our mowing heights, really work on not having our sites as compacted, start working on those issues. Along, of course, wood planting more than native grasses, that'd be a really cool thing. But, you know, getting over to those construction sites, we were looking at that and how degraded that actually is when we're actually building, we need to maybe talk to the contractor, see if we can, well, prevent that compaction, because, you know, at some point we try to go back out and establish a lawn and have just an awful time because of some of those issues on that site. So those are some of the things that we can really work on. We need to work on soil structure, making sure we don't have compaction, increasing soil biology, all really cool things that we can actually change to well, improve the urban environment.
Jeff, thank you so much for being here today. I know if our viewers want to learn more about what the city's doing for water quality and our stormwater program, they can visit siouxfalls.org/green. But do you have a website where they can go learn more about the NRCS?
You can go on to NRCS's website. It's nrcs.usda.gov, or our YouTube site for that matter. So,
Great. Well, thank you so much.
thanks for having me.